Now, I was standing in last night and the night before for the great James Will, and we discussed many of the big international issues which are still on the table today. The state of war, the gravest since 1974, between not just an Arab adversary, but now an Iranian adversary and a Russian adversary on the occupied Golan Heights, which was illegally seized from Syria by Israel in 1967. It's still illegally occupied. It is not Israel. Therefore, Iran didn't fire any rockets into Israel. I'm making this point because blithering idiots or teenage scribblers in the mass media don't seem to know the difference. Perhaps if it didn't start in the digital age, they think it's medieval history. We'll be talking too about the Korean Peninsula and the imminent summit for 3 days in Singapore, where there are, I think, a plethora of McDonald's, and therefore burgers and Diet Coke will be no problem to keep the little rocket man and the big orange man fully sated. Let's hope something good comes out of that. The big orange man will be here walking on the 13th of July, and we better start looking forward to that also. And then there's Theresa May's volte-face on the Grenfell disaster inquiry, where she's done now what she should have done from the beginning and expand the inquiry panel to include people in whom the survivors, the families of the bereaved, they have some confidence. We'll be talking also about Brexit, now in a state of absolute crisis, and it's very unlikely that we're going to reach the finishing line of the whole Brexit affair with this government in one piece. But I want to talk right up front about something that nobody else is talking about. And it was sinister enough that the Daily Telegraph published the story, worrying enough that someone called Paul Carter, who seems to have no footprint in the social media sphere, was commissioned by the Daily Telegraph to write it, but the contents of it are sinister indeed. The article in the Daily Telegraph yesterday postulates the possibility of an army coup overthrowing a Jeremy Corbyn government on a whole raft of non sequiturs, of fake news, that Corbyn might have a referendum on the abolition of the monarchy, might pull Britain out of NATO. I wish he would do both of those things, but he has no intention of doing either. That Corbyn will break from the international, that is to say, Western foreign policy consensus. I wish he would, but he appears to have no intention of so doing. But that notwithstanding, the Daily Telegraph thought it proper to examine the circumstances in which it might happen that the tanks would be on the streets of Britain overthrowing the elected government. If that doesn't make your blood run cold, you're already a reptile. Now, this is not the first time that such talk has been in the air, and sadly, I'm old enough to remember vividly when it was, and that was the proximate peg for the article. It's 50 years since a group of finks gathered in the rather palatial home of Earl Mountbatten to consider overthrowing that well-known Bolshevik, the multiple election-winning Labour leader Harold Wilson. And we'll be talking to an expert on these matters in just a few minutes about that. Harold Wilson was a great political figure who dominated British politics for almost all of the 1960s and almost all of the 1970s. He was a moderate social democrat, but his house was burgled. His office was burgled. He was accused by rogue individuals in the security services of being a long-secreted Soviet agent and agent of the KGB, a bit like Jeremy Corbyn was so accused. Harold Wilson was presiding over seismic changes in the British economy and in the wider British society. He was a great reforming Labour Prime Minister. And that's why Earl Mountbatten and the owners then of the Daily Mirror convened their cabal in Mountbatten's palace and seriously discussed which army forces would move here and move there, who would deliver the coup de grace on the Labour government in 1968, and who would replace Harold Wilson. Earl Mountbatten was to be the man, presumably presiding from the dispatch box in the House of Lords, unless he was to resign and fight a by-election somewhere. But then these constitutional niceties wouldn't matter much if the elected Labour government had been overthrown by military force. It's said by some, including Paul Carter, that Mountbatten himself pulled the plug on the plot, and Solly Zuckerberg, the government's chief scientific advisor, did the same. I'm not so sure myself. They lost their nerve. They didn't go through with it, but not before they had designated the Tower of London as the prison into which the Labour Prime Minister, Mr. Wilson, would be placed, incarcerated at Traitors' Gate, even though the traitors would have been the people who put him there. Moreover, the Shetland Islands was designated by the plotters as a place for the internment of 4,000 to 5,000 leftists like me, though I would have been too junior to be on their radar at the time. But you could be sure that if such a coup were mounted against Jeremy Corbyn, you would hear from me no more, unless I was able to get my hands on Radio Free Shetland. The author, Paul Carter, does make the point that social media would make it rather more difficult to mount such a coup than it might have been in 1968, when the men that owned the newspapers were in on the plot. Perhaps they would be again were it to happen to Mr. Corbyn. But, as the author makes clear, the Erdogan approach would be open, and Jeremy Corbyn better learn how to operate his own mobile phone on Snapchat, on Instagram, on Twitter and on Facebook, because he would have to be communicating thereby to the millions of British people who would surely pour onto the streets to defend the Prime Minister that they had elected. Or would they? We'll be talking about all of these issues, national and international, but we'll also be talking in the last hour to the great Robin Finlay. I get the impression that there were many thousands of you out there, like me, fascinated by the lady who does our traffic news, but just didn't know that anybody else was, until I broke the ice and said that I thought she was a radio star. Suddenly, all over social media, people wanted to know more about Robin Finlay. Why is she perky sometimes and oh so po-faced other times? Is it the traffic that gets her down? Is it the weather in northwest England where she seems to broadcast from? Which part of Scotland does she hail from? All of these questions and more. And at the end of tonight's show, I Am Robin Finlay will be an even bigger radio star than she already is. All that, and this is the death anniversary of the great Bob Marley. It's the mother of all talk shows.